Beyond slavery, economic secrets, political manipulations, and forgotten battles, they told you it was about slavery. And they weren't lying, but they weren't telling the whole truth either. Because behind the black and white narrative of a noble North fighting to free enslaved people from a brutal South lies a hidden war, a war of capital, corruption, power, and forgotten blood. This is not the Civil War you learned in school. This is the story they buried. To understand the truth, we need to go back, not to 1861, but to the 1820s. The early decades of America's expansion were driven by two very different visions for the country. In the North, a new industrial revolution was exploding factories, railroads, and mechanized production. The South, however, stayed loyal to agriculture, cotton, and slave labor. At the heart of this divide was one thing: profit. Slavery made Southern elites incredibly rich. Cotton exports brought in 75% of the world's supply. And it wasn't just Southern planters who benefited. Northern textile mills depended on that cotton. Wall Street banks financed Southern plantations. Insurance companies like Aetna and New York Life insured slaves as property. So if you're imagining the North as purely anti-slavery moralists, think again. Slavery wasn't just a Southern institution, it was a national business model. But as the country grew westward, that model came under threat. Would slavery expand into new territories like Kansas, Nebraska, and California, or would free labor take root? The fight over this question tore Congress apart, and every compromise, from the Missouri Compromise to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, only delayed the inevitable. Let's pause on Kansas 1854. Here, an undeclared war began. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded the territory to sway whether it would become a free or slave state. What followed was brutal homes burned, towns massacred, and the rise of a radical abolitionist named John Brown, who murdered pro-slavery settlers in cold blood and later led a failed raid on Harper's Ferry. His goal: spark a national slave revolt. His legacy: divide the nation beyond repair. But what's rarely discussed is how powerful business lobbies in the North used this crisis to gain political leverage. Railroad companies wanted Western lands cleared for tracks. Slavery complicated that. Northern industrialists wanted tariffs to protect their goods. The South demanded free trade. So while the morality of abolition played on the public stage, the backrooms were filled with economic plotting. Then came the election of Abraham Lincoln. In 1860, he won with only 40% of the popular vote and wasn't even on the ballot in 10 Southern states. To Southerners, this wasn't just a political loss, it was a takeover. They believed the North would now use federal power to destroy their economy and culture, and they were right in one sense. Because what followed wasn't just a rebellion, it was a violent divorce between two competing empires. By early 1861, 11 Southern states had seceded. The Confederate States of America was born, and with it, the bloodiest conflict in American history. But here's what most people don't know: the war was also an economic coup. Let's talk about the Morrill Tariff, passed just weeks before Lincoln took office. This law massively raised import duties. Great for Northern manufacturers, devastating for the South, which imported nearly all its goods. With Southern representatives gone from Congress, the North now had unchecked legislative power, and they used it. Overnight, Southern planters were forced to pay more for European goods, while being taxed harder on their exports. The message was clear: the new federal government would serve Northern business interests. And it didn't stop there. Lincoln used the war to pass major capitalist reforms: the National Banking Acts giving Wall Street banks control over national currency and credit, the Homestead Act opening 270 million acres of land to settlers, creating small farm economies that would feed northern cities, the Pacific Railway Act giving away land and money to build transcontinental railroads, creating billionaires while war raged. These acts were revolutionary. They transformed America from a republic of farmers to a modern industrial empire. But while the powerful reshaped the economy, ordinary Americans paid the price. The Civil War wasn't just Union vs. Confederacy, it was rich vs. poor. In both North and South, the draft allowed the wealthy to buy their way out of service. In the North, 300 could buy you a substitute. In the South, owning 20 slaves exempted you. The poor, immigrants, laborers, and farmers died in their place. In 1863, rage boiled over in New York City, where Irish immigrants, already marginalized, were drafted to fight for a cause they barely understood. They saw Black Americans as economic competition and scapegoated them violently. What followed were the New York draft riots, one of the deadliest urban uprisings in U.S. history. Over 100 people were killed. Black men were lynched in the streets, orphanages burned. This wasn't just civil war. This was civil collapse, and still, the war dragged on. Let's shift our gaze to the forgotten fronts. Most Americans know Gettysburg, Antietam, and Bull Run. But what about Poison Spring in Arkansas? There, in 1864, Confederate troops executed surrendered black Union soldiers, an act of racial terror that remains almost unknown today. What about Fort Pillow, where Confederate forces under Nathan Bedford Forrest massacred black soldiers after they surrendered? These were not exceptions, they were patterns. Even within Union ranks, black soldiers were treated as second class. They received lower pay, poor equipment, and were often placed in the most dangerous positions. Yet they fought with unmatched courage, knowing full well that capture meant death, not imprisonment. Then there were the Native Americans, caught in the middle. Many tribes, like the Cherokee and Choctaw, sided with the Confederacy, not out of allegiance, but desperation. They were promised autonomy and land. After the war, those promises were betrayed, tribes were punished, their land seized, and their treaties shredded. So much for freedom. And when the war finally ended in 1865 and slavery was officially abolished, a new system of control emerged. The 13th Amendment, celebrated as a milestone of justice, contained a clause that changed everything. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States except as a punishment for crime. This loophole was no accident. It gave birth to Convict leasing, a system where black men were arrested en masse for minor crimes, then leased out to mines, railroads, and plantations. It was slavery by another name. In Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, former slaves were now chained in labor camps, their bodies worked to death. Corporations profited, the government looked the other way. The Civil War didn't end slavery, it privatized it, and as the South was rebuilt under Reconstruction, a wave of terror began. The Ku Klux Klan, formed by ex-Confederate officers, launched a campaign of fear, lynchings, arson, and political assassination. They weren't just angry racists. They were part of a counter-revolution. Their goal was to reverse the outcomes of war, and they nearly succeeded. By 1877, Reconstruction was dead. Federal troops were pulled out. Black politicians were removed. Jim Crow laws took root. The South had lost the war but was slowly winning the peace. And the North? The same industrialists who profited during war now built corporate empires. Steel, oil, railroads, monopolies grew unchecked. Former Union generals became businessmen. Former abolitionists became silent. The cause of freedom faded into the background. So was the Civil War about slavery? Yes, but it was also about control. Control over land, labor, and the future of American power. It was a war between two visions of empire, and in the end, both won in different ways. The South preserved its racial hierarchy through new laws and new chains. The North built a capitalist empire on the ruins of war. And the people, black, poor, immigrant, native, were left behind. They told you it was about freedom. They told you it ended in victory. But history is written by those who profit from forgetting. And this is the version they erased.